This is the time when the gods descended from heaven.
For centuries, the story seemed settled. Rome had spoken. Councils had drawn boundaries. Painters had given the West its familiar face of Christ. The canon, for most believers, looked closed. The portrait looked complete. The argument looked over. And then, from the cliffs of Ethiopia, the silence started to break. Not with a new religion, not with a viral rumor, not with a novelist's invention, but with manuscripts, copied in Greece, guarded in monasteries, preserved in a Christian tradition older than many Europeans ever imagined when they picture the history of the church. Manuscripts that do not erase Jesus, but widen the frame around him. Manuscripts that preserve books most Western Christians never read. Texts early Christians knew, quoted, debated, and eventually left outside the canon used by most churches. Now a filmmaker with global reach has stepped straight into that fault line. Mel Gibson has said his long-awaited resurrection film must begin with the fall of the angels, move through hell, and travel across realms. To some, it sounds like spectacle. To others, it sounds uncannily close to ancient Jewish and early Christian visionary literature, especially the books preserved most fully in Ethiopic tradition, like 1 Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah. That is where the tension begins. Because the real mystery is not whether Ethiopia hit a different Jesus. The real mystery is more serious than that. It is why some texts remain central in one ancient Christian tradition and marginal in another. Why one church preserved 81 canonical books while most Western Christians inherited far fewer. Why a text quoted in Jude and defended by Tertullian became, over time, a book many believers never even heard of. So the question is no longer whether history forgot something. The question is what exactly was forgotten, and whether forgotten material changes the story or only reveals how incomplete the modern telling has become. Ethiopia is one of the world's oldest continuously Christian civilizations. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church maintains a biblical tradition whose canon totals 81 books, 46 in the Old Testament and 35 in the New Testament. And it preserves texts such as 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah in ways that distinguish it from most Western canons. The Garima Gospels are real manuscripts of major historical importance. Oxford has described them as the earliest surviving Ethiopian gospel books and as among the most important illustrated gospel books to survive from antiquity. Radiocarbon work reported by scholars placed them broadly between the 4th and 7th centuries, much earlier than older assumptions that dated them to the medieval period. 1 Enoch is an ancient Jewish work, composed in stages roughly between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. It was important in ancient Judaism and early Christianity, and survives complete only in Ethiopic, though fragments were also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and in other ancient languages. The Epistle of Jude quotes material associated with 1 Enoch, and many scholars believe Jude 14 to 15 directly cites 1 Enoch 1:9. The Ascension of Isaiah is also real and important, but it must be handled carefully. Britannica describes it as a composite pseudepigraphal work whose final edited form appeared in the 2nd century CE, surviving intact only in an Ethiopic edition, with fragments in Greek, Coptic, Latin, and Old Slavonic. Its visionary section includes a tour of the 7 heavens, and became influential in later Christian thought. Mel Gibson has publicly said that the resurrection of the Christ is extremely ambitious, that it must begin with the fall of the angels, and that it involves hell and Sheol. Reporting also indicates that Lionsgate announced the film as a 2-part release for spring 2027. What scholars debate is not whether these texts exist, but how they should be interpreted. They debate how directly New Testament authors depended on Enochic traditions. They debate whether imagery shared between 1 Enoch, Daniel, the Gospels, and Revelation reflects direct literary borrowing, a shared symbolic world, or layered traditions circulating through Second Temple Judaism. They debate how much the Ascension of Isaiah preserves early beliefs about Christ and how much reflects later editorial shaping. Scholars also debate canon history. The later marginalization of books like Enoch in most Western traditions was not a single cinematic act of suppression. The Synod of Laodicea did state that uncanonical books should not be read in church, but even the authenticity of the canon list commonly associated with Canon 60 is marked as questionable in standard church history transmission. In other words, the story is institutional and gradual, not reducible to one clean moment of burial. Here is where speculation begins. Some modern commentators argue that Ethiopian texts preserve a radically different, deliberately hidden original Jesus that institutional Christianity erased. Others claim Gibson has uncovered a secret Christology the church tried to keep from the world. Those claims go well beyond what the evidence securely shows. What the evidence supports is narrower and still fascinating. Ethiopia preserved ancient texts and traditions that remain outside most Western biblical canons, and those texts contain cosmic, apocalyptic, and visionary portrayals of the divine world that modern audiences often do not associate with mainstream images of Jesus. That is not the same as proving a conspiracy. It is proof of a larger early Christian and Jewish universe than many viewers were taught to expect. The anomaly is not that Ethiopia has ancient books. The anomaly is a gap between what modern Christians often think early Christianity looked like and what the surviving record actually shows. Most popular imagination receives a streamlined inheritance. For Gospels, a set canon, a stable image, a largely settled theology. But the first centuries of Judaism and Christianity were noisier than that. They were crowded with apocalypses, heavenly ascents, angelic rebellions, cosmic judgments, rival interpretations, and communities spread across languages from Greek to Syriac to Guizi. That is why the Ethiopian archive feels so unsettling. It does not necessarily overturn Christianity. It reintroduces complexity. It reminds the audience that ancient faith was not born in a single corridor of Rome or Constantinople. It was argued, copied, translated, carried, and preserved across Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean alike. And then the deeper tension appears. Because once viewers hear Gibson describe a resurrection narrative stretching from angelic rebellion to the death of the last apostle, they begin hearing echoes in texts outside the standard Western Bible. The ascension of Isaiah describes layered heavens. 1 Enoch preserves elaborate visions of judgment, heavenly order, and the Son of Man Jude quotes Enoch. Tertullian defended Enoch, yet most modern believers never read any of it. That mismatch creates the curiosity gap. If these works were known in antiquity, why did they become invisible to the modern religious imagination? If Ethiopia preserved them, why did the West forget them? And if Gibson is drawing near this ancient visionary material, whether directly or indirectly, is his film about to reopen a theological landscape that was never really gone, only left outside the frame? The breakthrough is not a single lost manuscript suddenly hauled out of a cave. The breakthrough is cumulative. Radiocarbon dating, large-scale digitization, manuscript cataloging, better philology, and wider public access. Oxford-linked scholarship on the Garima Gospels helped push Ethiopian Christianity back into the center of late antique manuscript history. HMML and related Ethiopic manuscript imaging projects have spent years photographing and preserving Guizi manuscripts, making a world once locked behind geography and fragility more visible to scholars. Steve Delamarter's name is closely tied to that imaging effort, which has helped move Ethiopic manuscript studies out of the margins and into broader academic conversation. New technology matters here because fragile texts do not yield their history easily. Multispectral imaging can recover writing too faint for the naked eye. Digital repositories let scholars compare versions across languages and centuries. Pattern analysis can expose scribal habits, translation shifts, and textual families that older scholarship could only guess at. If AI enters the story, it must be described realistically. AI can help with handwriting recognition, text restoration, script classification, and large-scale comparison of wording across manuscript traditions. Researchers already use machine learning for ancient texts and scripts, including work on Ethiopic recognition and the broader restoration of damaged inscriptions. But AI cannot tell historians which theology is true, cannot prove divine inspiration, and cannot magically detect conspiracy from a textual difference. It is an accelerator for analysis, not an oracle. That is the real breakthrough. For the first time, the audience is living in an era when the Ethiopian manuscript world is no longer almost unreachable to outsiders. The rope-hung monastery remains dramatic, but the greater revolution is quieter. The archive is becoming legible. This is where the stakes rise. Because once the Ethiopian tradition is taken seriously, the argument stops being about one actor, one director, or one provocative podcast appearance. It becomes an argument about authority. Conservative scholars urge caution. They point out correctly that non-canonical does not mean false, but it also does not mean equal in status to the four canonical Gospels within most Christian traditions. Historians warn against flattening centuries of canon formation into a melodrama of villains and victims. Texts like Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah are invaluable witnesses to ancient belief, but they are not a shortcut to proving that the institutional church knowingly erased a truer Jesus. At the same time, another camp insists that Western Christianity has often undertold its own diversity. They argue that African Christian traditions were sidelined in the modern imagination, and that Ethiopia's preservation of books like Enoch and Jubilees is not a curiosity, but a challenge to Eurocentric assumptions about where mainstream Christian memory was kept alive. On that point, the manuscripts themselves force respect. The Garima Gospels, the Guizi tradition, and the manuscript imaging projects do not need sensationalism to be significant. Then there is institutional hesitation. Churches generally move slowly with texts that can be easily misused by internet myth-making. Scholars know that once a phrase like forbidden gospel escapes into the public sphere, nuance usually dies first. That is why many responsible historians speak in careful distinctions. Preserved does not mean secret. Excluded from one canon does not mean universally banned. Quoted by early Christians does not mean universally accepted as scripture. The caution is not cowardice. In many cases, it is what seriousness sounds like. And yet, caution alone cannot dissolve the tension, because Gibson's language is dramatic. The Ethiopian manuscript record is real, and modern audiences are newly prepared to connect the two. Whether or not his film draws directly from Ethiopic tradition, it is walking onto the same terrain. Angels' descent, judgment, cosmic conflict, and a Christ larger than modern devotional minimalism. That is why the story keeps escalating. Not because the evidence proves a cover-up, but because the evidence proves that the early Christian imagination was far more expansive than many institutions, classrooms, or pulpits have made it seem. The conventional explanation is that nothing here overturns Orthodox Christianity. Ethiopia preserved a broader canon and important ancient texts, but the core claims about Jesus and the canonical Gospels remain the center of Christian doctrine for most churches. In this reading, Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah are context texts. They illuminate the symbolic and theological world in which Christianity emerged, but they do not replace the New Testament. The alternative theory argues that Ethiopian preservation exposes how much of early Christianity was domesticated in the West. In this reading, the cosmic, apocalyptic Christ was not invented later, but softened later. The gentle teacher-only image is seen as incomplete, while the Ethiopian preservation of Enochic and Isaianic visionary worlds helps restore the scale, terror, and majesty early believers may have associated with divine reality. The skeptical position is that modern internet culture is exaggerating the evidence. Yes, Ethiopia preserved ancient books. Yes, those books matter. But no, that does not prove the church buried the real Jesus. Skeptics would say the current fascination reflects a familiar pattern. Modern audiences project anti-establishment desires onto incomplete evidence, turning complex canon history into a thriller. Each interpretation contains something worth hearing. The conventional view protects doctrinal clarity. The alternative view recovers forgotten breadth. The skeptical view guards against overreach. The strongest documentary does not force one answer. It lets the audience feel the pressure between them. Why does this matter? Because beneath the manuscript debates lies a deeper human question. Who gets to define memory? Empires define it. Councils define it. Liturgies define it. Painters define it. Filmmakers define it. But sometimes a remote monastery defines it too. Quietly, without armies, without publicity, without winning the argument in the capital. That is the emotional force of Ethiopia in this story. Not that it offers a fantasy of forbidden truth, descending from the mountains to destroy everything else, but that it preserves continuity in a world obsessed with official centers. It reminds the audience that Christian history did not belong to one continent, one language, or one institution. A faith that moved through Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Aksum, and beyond was always larger than the maps later believers drew around it. And the figure at the center of all this, Jesus, becomes philosophically harder to contain. If the ancient record is taken seriously, then the question is no longer only what Jesus taught, but how different communities learn to imagine his scale. Teacher, Savior, Judge, Logos, Beloved One, Son of Man, Cosmic Mediator. These are not identical emphases. They are overlapping attempts to speak about a figure so influential that every tradition framed him through its own vocabulary of awe. That may be why these texts continue to disturb modern audiences. They return mystery to a story many assumed had become fully manageable. They do not merely ask whether a certain book should have stayed in the Bible. They ask whether modern religious imagination has become too small for the ancient world that produced Christianity in the first place. And once that question is asked, it does not easily go away. So the final image is not a council chamber. It is a mountain, a manuscript in dim light, ink on skin, a language many modern believers cannot read, a tradition that did not vanish, even when much of the world stopped looking its way. And somewhere far from the monastery, a modern filmmaker preparing to put angels, hell, descent, and resurrection back on the screen for millions. Maybe the coming shock is not that Ethiopia preserved a different Christ. Maybe the shock is that history preserved a larger world around Christ than the modern West was ever taught to remember. And that leaves one unresolved question. If ancient Christianity was always broader, stranger, and more cosmically charged than most people realized, what else is still waiting in the manuscript traditions that survived outside the familiar canon? History rarely disappears. More often, it survives in places power forgot to keep watching. If there's one thought worth leaving in the silence, it is this. Sometimes the most explosive discovery is not a new text, but an old text finally being read again. If this documentary were on screen, the comments section would have only one honest assignment. Which explanation feels most convincing? The canonical one, the Ethiopian preservation argument, or the skeptical reading that this mystery is being overstated?